The world stood at a precipice, its people unaware that the coming storm would reshape the destiny of humankind. In the aftermath of the First World War, that war to end all wars, the nations of Earth clung desperately to the fragile promise of peace. Yet beneath the surface, the old wounds festered. Borders had been redrawn, empires dismantled, economies shattered, and the psyche of millions scarred beyond recognition. The victors stood triumphant, but hollow. The vanquished, humiliated, seethed with resentment. From the ashes of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, new nations emerged, fragile, unsteady, and yearning for identity. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Treaty of Versailles had imposed a burden so heavy that it crushed the nation's pride beneath its weight. Reparations, disarmament, and guilt, these words would haunt a generation. But within that humiliation, a spark of fury began to smolder. The 1920s gave birth to an age of illusion. The world danced to the rhythm of jazz, industrial innovation, and newfound freedoms. But beneath the glittering surface of modernity, cracks spread like lightning across the sky. The Great Depression struck in 1929, bringing economies to their knees. Factories closed, families starved, the social order began to crumble. And when despair grips the hearts of millions, the promise of strong leadership, of national rebirth, becomes a siren's call too powerful to resist. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already risen to power, draped in the banners of Roman glory. He preached discipline, order, and empire, a resurrection of past grandeur. In Germany, a failed artist and bitter veteran of the trenches, Adolf Hitler, seized the same narrative. The Führer promised not only revenge for Versailles, but a new world, one forged in the image of racial purity and absolute obedience. By 1933, democracy in Germany was dead. The Nazi Party, through a blend of propaganda, fear, and orchestrated chaos, had transformed a nation of thinkers, engineers, and dreamers into the engine of a dark ideology. As Hitler's voice echoed through the halls of the Reichstag, the world watched, some with alarm, others with apathy. In the East, another power stirred. Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, born from the ashes of revolution and civil war, had become an industrial and military colossus ruled by terror. And in the distant islands of Japan, the rising sun sought dominion over Asia, its imperial ambitions cloaked in nationalism and divine destiny. The stage was set. The world's fragile peace stood upon trembling ground. In 1936, Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland, a direct violation of Versailles. The response from Britain and France was silence. Appeasement was the order of the day, as leaders like Neville Chamberlain sought to buy peace with diplomacy and hope. Yet every concession fed the beast further. That same year, the Spanish Civil War erupted, a brutal preview of the global conflict to come. In the skies over Guernica, German bombers tested their new tactics of blitzkrieg lightning war as the world turned its gaze away. By 1938, the Anschluss had come. Austria was absorbed into the Reich, greeted by cheering crowds and Nazi banners that unfurled like blood-red waves. Soon after, Hitler's gaze turned toward the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Once again, the world hesitated. The Munich Agreement, hailed as peace for our time, handed Hitler his prize without a shot fired. Winston Churchill warned that appeasement would lead only to greater catastrophe, but his words fell on weary ears. Then came 1939. Germany's pact with the Soviet Union stunned the world. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, a cynical arrangement that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. On September 1st, German forces crossed the Polish border. The Blitzkrieg had begun. In a matter of weeks, Poland was carved apart by the twin predators, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Britain and France declared war, but their forces stood idle behind the Maginot Line, watching as darkness consumed the East. The following spring, the Nazi war machine roared to life once more. Denmark and Norway fell in swift succession. Then came the invasion of France, a campaign so rapid, so devastating, that the world reeled. The Wehrmacht bypassed the Maginot Line through the Ardennes forest, cutting through the heart of Europe like a blade. In 6 weeks, France, the proud victor of the First World War, collapsed. Paris fell, and Hitler stood triumphant beneath the Eiffel Tower. Britain now stood alone. Across the English Channel, the Battle of Britain began. In the summer of 1940, the skies over London were set ablaze. The Luftwaffe sought to crush the Royal Air Force, to prepare the way for invasion. But the RAF, outnumbered and outgunned, held the line. Churchill's defiant words echoed through the airwaves. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. As the bombs rained down upon London in the Blitz, a new kind of war emerged. One fought not just on battlefields, but in the hearts of civilians. Children were evacuated. Cities burned. Yet the British spirit refused to break. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, Mussolini's ambitions faltered. His campaigns in North Africa and Greece stumbled, forcing Hitler to divert precious resources to rescue his ally. In the East, the Fuhrer began to eye his ultimate prize, the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, was launched in June 1941. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed the border, sweeping across vast plains toward Moscow. The Soviet forces, caught by surprise, retreated and burned their own lands behind them, a scorched earth of sacrifice and defiance. But the German advance slowed. The Russian winter arrived, fierce and unforgiving. At Moscow and later at Stalingrad, the tides began to turn. In the rubble of that city, on the Volga, German divisions were encircled and annihilated. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered amid the snow and blood of the Eastern Front. Yet, as Europe burned, another inferno erupted across the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor. The attack crippled the American Pacific Fleet and shocked a nation that had long remained neutral. A date which will live in infamy, declared President Franklin D. Roosevelt as the United States entered the war. Now it was truly a world conflict. The Pacific War raged from the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the South Seas. The Japanese Empire, disciplined and ruthless, sought domination across Asia. But the United States, awakened and united, began a long and brutal campaign of island hopping, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, each step purchased with unimaginable sacrifice. In North Africa, Allied forces under Montgomery and Eisenhower began to push back the Axis tide. The deserts that once echoed with Rommel's victories now bore witness to his defeat. By 1943, Italy had fallen. Mussolini was overthrown, and the Allies turned their eyes to Europe's heart. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy under relentless fire. The cost was immense, the courage beyond measure. and from those bloody shores the march toward Berlin began. The snows of the Eastern Front melted into rivers of blood as the Red Army surged westward. Stalingrad had broken the German army's illusion of supremacy. Kursk had crushed its spine. Now, in 1944, Soviet forces thundered across Ukraine and Poland, reclaiming cities that had been buried under the iron heel of occupation. Entire divisions moved like living machines, tanks, artillery, and infantry advancing in waves that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. In their wake, they found only ruins and the silent ghosts of extermination as the Allies pressed from the west and the Soviets from the east. Hitler's empire began to crumble. The man who had once commanded millions now hid beneath the ruins of his own creation. Yet in his bunker beneath Berlin, he still dreamed of vengeance, still demanded total war, still ordered the sacrifice of a nation for his delusions of grandeur. By early 1945, the war's outcome was clear, but its horror had not yet reached its climax. The Allies liberated France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, their forces pushing steadily toward the Rhine. In the Ardennes, the Germans launched one final counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate gamble that sought to split the Allied armies. For weeks, the forests of Belgium were engulfed in chaos, snow, and fire. But when the smoke cleared, the last German offensive had failed. The Reich was finished. Meanwhile, in the east, the Red Army unleashed Operation Begression, an unstoppable assault that shattered German lines and swept through Eastern Europe. By April, Soviet troops had encircled Berlin. The once mighty capital of the Reich was now a wasteland of rubble, its people starving, its leaders delusional. Hitler, refusing to surrender, chose to end his life in the shadows of his bunker, leaving behind nothing but ashes and ruin. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the guns finally fell silent. But even as Europe celebrated, the war was far from over. Across the Pacific, the Empire of Japan still fought with a ferocity that defied reason. Each island, each stretch of ocean was a blood-soaked battleground. American bombers turned Japanese cities into infernos. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, all burned beneath storms of fire. Yet Japan refused to yield. Then, in August 1945, the world crossed a threshold from which it would never return. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, a single bomb fell upon Hiroshima. In an instant, the city vanished in a blinding flash of light. 80,000 souls erased. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The atomic age had begun. Emperor Hirohito, faced with annihilation, surrendered. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, Japan signed its capitulation. World War II, the most devastating conflict in human history, was finally over, but the cost defied comprehension. Over 70 million lives lost, cities reduced to ash, nations scarred for generations. The Holocaust had revealed humanity's darkest abyss, the mechanized extermination of 6 million Jews, along with countless others deemed unworthy by the Nazi regime. In the Nuremberg trials that followed, the world tried to define justice in the face of unimaginable evil. For the first time in history, leaders were held accountable for crimes against humanity. The war's aftermath redrew the map of the world. Europe lay divided, the West under the shield of American influence, the East under the iron grip of the Soviet Union. The old empires, British, French, Dutch, began to crumble, giving birth to new nations seeking self-determination. Colonialism's end had begun. In 1949, Germany was split in two, the Federal Republic in the west, the German Democratic Republic in the east. In the heart of Berlin, a wall would one day rise, the scar of a new conflict, not fought with bullets, but with ideology. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers locked in a rivalry that would define the next half-century. The Cold War had begun, an age of nuclear fear, espionage, and proxy wars. But amid the tension, the world sought healing. The United Nations was born in 1945, an imperfect yet hopeful attempt to prevent another global catastrophe. Across the globe, economies rebuilt. In Japan, cities rose from ashes into towers of steel and glass. In Europe, the Marshall Plan restored hope where despair had taken root. And in the hearts of survivors, a quiet vow took shape: never again. Yet the lessons of war, though etched in history, would be tested again and again in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, and beyond. World War II had not ended conflict. It had merely transformed it. But it had also sparked revolutions in science, technology, and human rights. The horrors of genocide gave birth to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The race for power ignited the space age. Out of ruin, humanity sought redemption. Today, the echoes of that war still shape our world, in alliances, in borders, in the fragile balance of peace. From the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Stalingrad, from the forests of Poland to the islands of the Pacific, the ghosts of World War II whisper their warning that hatred left unchecked consumes all, that freedom demands vigilance, that peace, though fragile, is worth every sacrifice. And so the world remembers not merely the battles, but the people, the soldier in the trench, the mother in the rubble, the child beneath the siren's wail. For theirs is the true story of World War II, the story of endurance, of suffering, and of hope reborn. Humanity emerged from that darkness changed forever, wiser, scarred, yet unbroken. And though the guns fell silent in 1945, the lessons of that war still call to us, urging remembrance, humility, and resolve. Because history, if forgotten, always returns, and the greatest war humanity ever fought must remain not only a memory, but a warning. The world exhaled, but the silence that followed was uneasy. In the ashes of World War II, humanity stood at a crossroads, between renewal and ruin, between hope and fear. Cities were gone, continents fractured, families scattered. Yet amid the rubble, something extraordinary began, the slow, determined rebuilding of civilization. Across Europe, the survivors emerged like ghosts from the ruins. Berlin, Warsaw, Rotterdam, once great cities, were now nothing more than fields of concrete and steel skeletons. In France, the streets that had once echoed with Nazi marches now filled with the songs of liberation and mourning. But the scars ran deeper than any crater. Entire generations were lost, not just in life, but in innocence, in faith. The victors, too, bore their burdens. America, once distant and divided by oceans, had become the leader of the free world. Its economy booming, its technology unmatched, its culture spreading like wildfire. But this newfound power came with a shadow. The Soviet Union, its victory drenched in unimaginable sacrifice, emerged from the war as both hero and conqueror. 27 million Soviets had perished. Entire cities had been erased, yet Joseph Stalin, ruthless as ever, turned triumph into tyranny. Eastern Europe fell under his grip. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, each becoming a puppet state in what Churchill would call the Iron Curtain. The peace that followed the Second World War was no true peace. It was a balance of terror. Two superpowers stood in opposition, each armed not with mere armies, but with weapons that could erase humanity itself. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The age of mutual annihilation had begun. The post-war years became a new kind of battlefield, one of ideology, espionage, and influence. The United States championed capitalism, democracy, and open markets. The Soviet Union spread communism through revolution and fear. In between lay a world divided, Europe split in two, Asia trembling, Africa, and the Middle East awakening from centuries of colonial control. In 1948, the Berlin blockade marked the first major confrontation of this new era. When Stalin cut off access to West Berlin, hoping to starve the Allies out, the West responded with defiance, an airlift of supplies that lasted nearly a year. Food, coal, medicine, more than 2 million tons of aid delivered from the skies. It was a triumph not just of logistics, but of will. Berlin became the symbol of freedom, an island of light in a sea of darkness. Meanwhile, across Asia, the remnants of empire began to crumble. India gained independence from Britain in 1947, igniting a wave of decolonization that swept across the globe. But independence often came with pain, partition, civil war, and bloodshed. In China, the civil war between nationalists and communists reignited after Japan's defeat. By 1949, Mao Zedong's Red Army had claimed victory, founding the People's Republic of China. The world's most populous nation had joined the communist camp. In 1950, war erupted again, this time in Korea. The Korean Peninsula became the first flashpoint of the Cold War, where North and South, communism and democracy, clashed in brutal stalemate. Millions died, yet the borders barely shifted. The message was clear. The Cold War would be fought not in Berlin or Moscow, but on the edges through proxy wars, coups, and revolutions. Back in Europe, the seeds of unity were being planted. The devastation of 2 world wars had taught a cruel lesson. Only cooperation could prevent a third. From the ashes of conflict rose new institutions, the European Coal and Steel Community, the forerunner of today's European Union. Old rivals, France, Germany, Italy, began to link their fates together, forging an economic and political partnership that would transform the continent. But in 1961, Berlin once again became the world's stage. In one night, barbed wire split the city in two. The Berlin Wall rose, concrete, watchtowers, and machine guns dividing families, dreams, and ideologies. To the east, the Soviet bloc tightened its hold. To the west, NATO stood firm, a shield of democracies bound by shared fear and hope. Beyond the politics and power struggles, the human story continued, of survival, of progress, of reinvention. The United States, enriched by war production and untouched by invasion, entered an age of prosperity. Suburbs spread, highways stretched across the continent, and a generation known as the asterisk baby boomers asterisk was born. Technology flourished. Jet engines, television, antibiotics, and computers transformed everyday life. But amid the prosperity, memories of the war lingered in the hearts of veterans, in the quiet grief of widows, and in the haunted eyes of those who had survived the camps. The Nuremberg trials had tried to bring justice to the architects of genocide. For the first time, the world declared that crimes against humanity would not go unpunished. But the scars of the Holocaust ran too deep for justice alone to heal. In 1948, the State of Israel was founded, a homeland for a people nearly annihilated. Yet even that birth came with bloodshed, as war erupted between Jews and Arabs, setting the stage for decades of conflict in the Middle East. The late 1940s and 1950s were an age of paradox, of hope and fear intertwined. While scientists dreamed of spaceflight and global communication, nations built weapons capable of ending civilization in minutes. The same spirit that had split the atom now reached for the stars. In 1957, the Soviet satellite Sputnik orbited the Earth, a beeping metal sphere that sent shockwaves across the globe. The space race had begun. By 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to journey beyond Earth, and 8 years later, the United States answered with Neil Armstrong's quiet words on the moon, asterisk, "That is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Asterisk, the legacy of World War II, its technology, its science, its political will, had propelled humanity into the cosmos. But the war's shadow was never far. In Vietnam, Cuba, and countless other places, the ideological struggle continued. In every coup, every uprising, every border drawn, echoes of the Second World War could be heard. The same desire for dominance, the same fear of the other, the same fragile pursuit of peace. As the 20th century advanced, the veterans of that great conflict grew old. Monuments rose, silent stone sentinels, guarding the memory of the fallen. Children studied the war in classrooms, but for those who lived it, the memories never faded. The smell of smoke, the whistle of bombs, the letters that never came home. By the dawn of the new millennium, only a few remained to tell their stories, the last witnesses to the most devastating event in human history. Their words, captured in film, in diaries, in fading photographs, became the last link to a world that must never be forgotten. World War II was not merely a clash of nations, it was a crucible of humanity. It revealed both the depths of our cruelty and the heights of our courage. It showed that progress and destruction can be born of the same hand. And it left behind a message carved into the bones of civilization itself, that freedom, compassion, and memory are the only defenses against our darkest nature. Today we walk through a world shaped entirely by that war, our borders, our alliances, our fears, our dreams. The digital age, the atomic age, the space age, all were born from its fires. And though the guns of 1945 have long fallen silent, their echoes still travel through time, reminding us of what we lost and what we must never lose again. Because history is not past, it is the mirror in which we see ourselves. And in the reflection of World War II, we glimpse both our capacity for ruin and our enduring will to rise again. The world that emerged from the wreckage of World War II was reborn not only in power and politics, but in soul. It was a civilization forced to confront itself, to gaze unflinchingly into the mirror of its own creation and destruction. The war had not simply redrawn borders, it had redefined what it meant to be human. In the years that followed, a collective reckoning began in philosophy, in art, in science, and in conscience. From the ruins of Auschwitz and Hiroshima, humanity's greatest question emerged. How could this happen? And what must we do to ensure it never happens again? Art became both wound and witness. In the paintings of Pablo Picasso and the writings of Albert Camus, the anguish of existence echoed, the absurdity of life in a world capable of such horror. Existentialism rose from the rubble of Europe, a philosophy that declared man alone responsible for meaning in a godless, shattered universe. In music, the old romantic grandeur gave way to dissonance and experimentation. Shostakovich's symphonies, composed under Soviet oppression, carried both defiance and despair. In literature, authors like Primo Levi, Anne Frank, and Elie Wiesel transformed survival into testimony. They wrote not as storytellers, but as witnesses for the dead. Meanwhile, science, once harnessed for destruction, sought redemption. The same minds that had built atomic bombs now turned to medicine, to space exploration, to the study of life itself. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick revealed the structure of DNA, unlocking the secret code of existence. Penicillin, radar, jet propulsion, all products of wartime innovation, now drove peacetime progress. Hospitals were rebuilt, vaccines developed, the first computers assembled. The war had accelerated human ingenuity, but it had also taught that knowledge, without morality, is a double-edged sword. The creation of the United Nations marked humanity's attempt to give law to its conscience. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, declared that every person, regardless of race, creed, or nation, possessed inherent dignity. It was a revolutionary idea born from the realization that indifference and silence had enabled atrocity. But as the decades unfolded, the war's cultural and moral legacy diverged. For some, it became myth, a story of good versus evil, of liberation and heroism. For others, it remained an open wound, a reminder that the line between savior and destroyer is perilously thin. The Holocaust, in particular, transformed the world's understanding of evil. No longer could cruelty be seen as a mere byproduct of war. It was revealed as something far deeper, systemic, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly ordinary. The trials at Nuremberg and later at The Hague sought to define accountability in an age where individuals could claim they were only following orders. From those proceedings emerged a new principle, that morality transcends command. It was a fragile yet profound step toward international justice. Across continents, the war's legacy rippled through generations. In Asia, nations scarred by occupation and devastation, Japan, Korea, China, rose from their ruins into industrial giants. Japan, once the aggressor, reinvented itself as a symbol of peace and technological mastery. From the ashes of Hiroshima came a philosophy of humility and innovation. Cameras, cars, and computers became the tools of a new kind of power. The Japanese Constitution, written under American supervision, renounced war forever, a remarkable transformation from empire to pacifism. In Europe, a different metamorphosis took place. After centuries of conquest and rivalry, the nations of the continent slowly knit themselves together, first through coal and steel, then through shared law, trade, and identity. The European Union emerged not from ambition, but from fear, the fear that another war, another descent into madness, could end civilization itself. Germany, burdened by guilt, became a champion of peace and unity. Its reconstruction was not merely physical, but moral, a nation determined to atone through remembrance and democracy. In America, the war had birthed both triumph and transformation. The United States emerged as the unquestioned leader of the Western world, its economy unrivaled, its military vast. Yet within, a new consciousness began to stir. The return of black soldiers from the war, men who had fought fascism abroad while enduring segregation at home, ignited the civil rights movement. If freedom was worth dying for in Europe, it was worth living for in America. From that moral paradox, a revolution was born. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and countless others carried the torch of justice lit by the fires of global conflict. Women, too, found a new place in the post-war world. They had worked the factories, driven the trucks, built the planes. The image of Rosie the Riveter became more than propaganda. It was prophecy. Though many were pushed back into domestic life after the war, the seed of equality had been planted. Decades later, it would blossom into a movement that reshaped societies across the globe. And so from suffering came change, from loss, a renaissance. World War II had stripped humanity bare, revealing our capacity for cruelty, but also our resilience, our creativity, and our will to begin again. In the cultural imagination, the war never truly ended. It lived on in film, in art, in memory, not as nostalgia, but as warning. Cinematic masterpieces like The Bridge on the River Kwai, Schindler's List, and Saving Private Ryan sought to humanize the unimaginable, to give voice to the voiceless. Museums, memorials, and monuments rose in every nation, stone, steel, and silence carrying the weight of history. As the century turned, the veterans, those who had stormed beaches, liberated camps, and endured years of terror, began to fade away. Their numbers dwindled, their stories passed to younger generations, and with them went the last living connection to a world consumed by war. But even as their voices dimmed, their legacy deepened, because World War II was not merely an event, it was the defining crucible of modern humanity. Every global institution, every peace treaty, every alliance and conflict that followed bore its imprint. The Cold War, the technological revolution, the struggle for equality, all were the ripples of that great upheaval. And in the 21st century, as nations once again wrestle with tyranny, misinformation, and fear, the lessons of that war grow ever more vital. The ghosts of history whisper still, warning that freedom is fragile, that truth must be defended, that indifference is complicity. The Second World War was the costliest lesson ever written in blood. Its message endures not on battlefields, but in the conscience of those who remember. That civilization survives only when it remembers what it is capable of destroying and what it must always strive to protect. The ruins of Warsaw, the silence of Auschwitz, the fields of Normandy, the waters of Pearl Harbor all speak the same truth, that the story of World War II is not one of nations alone, but of humanity itself. And in that story and its pain, its courage, its endurance, lies both our past and our purpose. Because history is not a chain that binds us. It is a torch, one we must carry forward, lest the darkness return. The world moved forward, but it did not move on. The war had ended, yet its shadow lingered over every corner of the globe. Nations rebuilt, technologies flourished, ideologies hardened, and humanity, in its restless genius, began to shape a future born from both victory and vengeance. The mid-20th century became an era of paradox, progress and paranoia, innovation and insecurity. World War II had accelerated human advancement by decades, yet it had also unleashed forces that would test the very meaning of civilization. From the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki came not only horror, but revelation that mankind now held the power to destroy itself. This realization changed everything. The atomic bomb. That single, blinding flash became the emblem of a new age. It was both weapon and warning, miracle and menace. The same knowledge that split the atom would power cities, cure disease, and reach for the stars, yet it would also haunt every heartbeat of the modern world. The balance of terror replaced the balance of power. The Cold War was not a war of battlefields, but of nerves, a chess game played on a global board, with annihilation as the stakes. In 1949, NATO was formed, a defensive alliance uniting the Western world under American leadership. Soon after, the Soviet Union established the Warsaw Pact, its own sphere of loyalty, enforced by ideology and fear. Europe, once the center of empire, became a continent divided by walls and wire. The Iron Curtain descended from the Baltic to the Adriatic, a scar across civilization. On one side, democracy and capitalism. On the other, communism and command. Both claimed to represent freedom. Both justified their dominance in the name of peace. But beneath the ideological struggle, the spirit of humanity continued its march. The 1950s and 1960s became decades of transformation, a race not only for power, but for meaning. In science, the world leapt forward with astonishing speed. The same engineers who had built rockets for the V-2 program under Hitler now designed spacecraft under the banners of the United States and the Soviet Union. Wernher von Braun's Saturn V rocket would one day carry mankind to the moon, a journey that began, paradoxically, with a weapon of war. In 1969, when Neil Armstrong's boot touched the lunar dust, humanity glimpsed both its boundless potential and the long, dark road that had brought it there. Yet even as man walked on another world, his own remained fraught with division. The ideological struggle of the Cold War manifested in distant lands, proxy wars that carried the embers of World War II into new generations. In Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, and Korea, nations bled for causes born of 1945. The weapons were new: helicopters, jets, napalm, but the cost was the same: lives, innocence, and disillusionment. Meanwhile, a quieter revolution unfolded, one born not of power, but of conscience. The lessons of the war inspired a global awakening. In 1945, the United Nations had been created to prevent another catastrophe. But in the decades that followed, its mission expanded: to feed the hungry, to protect the innocent, to speak for those without a voice. Its blue flag became a symbol of fragile hope amid chaos. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted by Eleanor Roosevelt and others, became a moral compass for a wounded world. It was a statement born from the ashes of atrocity that all humans, regardless of race, religion, or nation, possessed inherent dignity. This ideal, fragile but profound, ignited movements that changed the course of history. The civil rights movement in America, the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, the feminist and decolonization waves across the globe all drew strength from the realization that freedom was not a gift from governments, but a birthright of humanity. It was as if the whole world, in the aftermath of war, had remembered what it meant to be alive. But peace had its own dangers. The prosperity of the post-war boom led to new forms of conflict, psychological, cultural, spiritual. In the West, consumerism rose from the factories that had once built tanks and bombers. Mass production gave birth to a new age of abundance: cars, televisions, suburbs, modern luxuries. Yet beneath it all, a quiet anxiety pulsed. Could humanity truly master the power it had unleashed? Could it learn to wield technology without losing its soul? By the late 20th century, the answers seemed uncertain. The Cold War reached its zenith. Nuclear arsenals expanded, spy satellites circled the planet, and entire generations grew up under the shadow of the mushroom cloud. Drills in classrooms, bunkers beneath cities, the haunting phrase, mutually assured destruction. All reminders that civilization now stood upon a razor's edge. And yet, somehow, peace held. Perhaps it was fear that preserved it, the knowledge that another war could mean the end of all things. But perhaps it was also wisdom, a hard-earned understanding that the cost of conflict had grown too great for even the most ambitious empire to bear. Then, in 1989, a miracle: the Berlin Wall fell. Concrete crumbled beneath the hands of a generation born long after the war that had divided their world. Families reunited, flags changed. The Soviet Union, exhausted and fractured, began to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And in 1991, the Cold War, that long, tense echo of World War II, finally ended. The world stood at the dawn of a new millennium, globalized, interconnected, and digital. The internet, satellite communication, and rapid innovation transformed human life faster than any empire or ideology ever had. But even in this brave new world, the legacy of the Second World War endured, not just in politics, but in memory. The Holocaust remained humanity's most solemn warning. Its survivors, their numbers fading, became living testaments to the necessity of remembrance. Museums, memorials, and archives rose around the world, ensuring that the cry of never again would not fade into silence. Yet the echoes of tyranny, nationalism, and prejudice continued to stir, proof that the lessons of the past must be learned again and again. World War II had changed everything, not only borders and governments, but consciousness itself. It had revealed the boundless potential of human ingenuity and the bottomless depths of its cruelty. It had proven that progress and peril are twins, that the light of civilization burns brightest only against the darkness that threatens it. And so, as the 21st century unfolds, the war remains our mirror. Its legacy lives in every peace treaty, every scientific discovery, every moral debate. When nations unite against injustice, when technology serves creation instead of destruction, when remembrance replaces denial, then the ghosts of the past rest a little easier. The story of World War II is not confined to the pages of history. It lives in us, in our institutions, our inventions, our fears, and our hopes. It is the foundation of the modern age, an age born of devastation, rebuilt by determination and sustained by the fragile, enduring belief that humanity can learn and rise in love again. And so, the world remembers. The soldier who fell, the mother who waited, the child who endured. The cities that burned, the faith that endured, the peace that was earned. From the dawn of mechanized war to the threshold of the digital age, one truth has never changed, that in the face of destruction, humanity's greatest strength is not its power, but its compassion. Because the war that changed humanity did not end in 1945, it continues in every act of remembrance, every stand against tyranny, every effort to build a world worthy of those who fell to make it free. And as long as the world remembers, the light of peace, however fragile, will never fade. In the darkness before dawn, when the world was still stitched together by fear and recovery, in the aftermath of the Second World War, humanity looked upward, beyond the bombed-out cities and fractured alliances, past the smoke of industrial rebirth and the sharpened edge of ideology. There hung a silent sky, vast, black, eternal. For thousands of years, humanity had prayed to it, mapped it, feared it. But now, for the first time, it was not myth or omen. It was destiny, and it would become the greatest battlefield the world had ever known, one without borders, without armies, without blood, yet capable of rewriting the fate of nations. For the space race did not begin with rockets. It began with fear, with rivalry, with two wounded empires struggling to rise from the ashes of war, each desperate to prove that its vision of the future must rule the earth. As the 20th century bled into its second half, the United States and the Soviet Union stood locked in a struggle for global supremacy. Democracy and capitalism on one side, communism and planned revolution on the other. Two systems incompatible in theory, irreconcilable in practice. Both had emerged victorious from war, yet neither felt secure enough to rest. And both understood a truth whispered in military corridors and political chambers across the world. Whoever controlled the skies would control tomorrow. But this story, this cosmic theater of ambition, did not begin with presidents or premiers. Its roots lie deeper, in centuries-old dreams, in the minds of poets, philosophers, and engineers who dared to imagine the impossible. Long before rockets roared across deserts or astronauts floated above Earth, ancient civilizations charted the heavens with a reverence bordering on worship. The Babylonians traced the wandering stars. The Greeks named constellations, still whispered today. Chinese astronomers recorded supernovas as far back as the Han Dynasty. Medieval scholars studied celestial spheres. Renaissance thinkers shattered them. And in the 17th century, Isaac Newton sat beneath an invisible dome of cosmos and whispered a revelation to the world, that what lifted the moon above the earth was the same force that pulled an apple to the ground. Humanity had unlocked the mathematics of the heavens. It would take centuries more to touch them. By the dawn of the 20th century, science moved faster than empire. Railroads crisscrossed continents. Airplanes defied gravity. Radio signals leapt across oceans. The human world shrank and its ambitions grew. Engineers like Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in Russia and Robert Goddard in the United States laid the foundations for rocketry, scribbling equations that would become the bones of spacecraft. Tsiolkovsky imagined metal tubes carrying humans into orbit. Goddard launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket in a quiet Massachusetts field. To the people watching, it was a modest experiment. To history, it was the first spark of a coming inferno. But fate would not allow these visions to unfold peacefully. Rockets, in their infancy, became weapons. As Europe plunged into the cataclysm of World War II, the Nazi regime sought a miracle weapon to reverse the tide of battle. Under the direction of a brilliant, ambitious, and morally ambiguous engineer named Werner von Braun, Germany developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile. It fell upon London with a thunder that shook the earth and terrified millions. Yet in its terrible shadow lay a truth both superpowers recognized. The future of warfare and the future of exploration belonged to rockets. When Germany collapsed, American and Soviet forces raced not only for land, but for mines. In Operation Paperclip, the United States captured von Braun and more than 100 members of his rocket team. The Soviets seized facilities, blueprints, and engineers, including Sergei Korolev, a visionary imprisoned under Stalin, now destined to become the father of Soviet spaceflight. The war had forged the tools. The Cold War would ignite the mission. As the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, tension seeped into every corner of global politics. Both nations sought not just military dominance, but ideological legitimacy, and space empty, silent, untouched became the perfect arena for proving the superiority of one system over the other. Every satellite launched, every orbit achieved, every astronaut sent beyond Earth would serve as a message to humanity. This is the future, and it belongs to us. The Soviets struck first. On October 4th, 1957, a metallic sphere the size of a beach ball soared into the heavens. Its name was Sputnik 1. Its radio pulses echoed across the world, simple beeps that shook the confidence of the most powerful nation on Earth. American newspapers spoke of a Sputnik panic. Schools accelerated science programs. Congress poured money into research. And in Moscow, Sergei Korolev smiled quietly. The sky, the sacred eternal sky, had been breached. Weeks later, Sputnik 2 carried Leica, a stray dog from Moscow's streets, becoming the first living creature to orbit Earth. The world looked upward in awe and dread. If the Soviets could place an object over American skies, what else could they place there? The race was no longer symbolic. It was existential. But the United States would not remain grounded. In 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized the creation of NASA, a civilian agency with a military backbone, born to restore national pride and ensure that the next chapter of the space race would be written in American hands. Engineers worked feverishly. Factories roared to life. The American people demanded progress, and politicians knew their future depended on it. Still, the Soviets pressed forward. In April 1961, humanity took its boldest step in history. A young Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a capsule christened Vostok 1. With a smile and a simple farewell, Poyakami, meaning let's go, he became the first human to leave Earth. He orbited the planet once in 108 minutes that redefined the boundaries of existence. For the first time, humanity had looked down upon its own world and seen it as a fragile blue sphere adrift in the vastness of the cosmos. The Soviets celebrated. The Americans trembled. But this moment, this triumph, did not end the race. It accelerated it. In May of that same year, President John F. Kennedy addressed Congress with a declaration that would echo through history. The United States, he proclaimed, would land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the decade was out. It was an impossible promise, a technological mountain beyond imagination. But America had staked its pride, its future, and its global authority upon it. And so began the most ambitious engineering endeavor in human history, the Apollo program. Factories churned, laboratories buzzed, entire cities became devoted to the task. Thousands of scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and visionaries worked day and night, some inspired by patriotism, others by fear, and many by the simple, enduring human desire to explore. The Gemini missions tested spacewalks, orbital mechanics, and rendezvous techniques. The Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built, rose from concrete pads like a tower of fire and thunder. Yet tragedy struck. In January 1967, a flash fire swept through the Apollo 1 command module during a test on the launch pad, killing astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The nation mourned. NASA reeled. But failure did not end the dream, it refined it. As the decade marched toward its close, the world watched with breath held. And on July 20th, 1969, under a sky lit by billions of silent stars, two men descended toward the lunar surface. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, history waiting beneath their feet. With a gentle whisper of dust and a grainy image broadcast across every continent, Armstrong stepped onto the moon and spoke words that bridged the entire human experience. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. In that moment, the space race reached its zenith. But the story was far from over. For once humans touched the moon, they could never return to an earthbound world.